they walked through a stream of people returning home from work, streetlights, storefronts, and car headlights lighting up the city in their own dynamic way. The name was unfamiliar, and Joanna looked at Perry curiously and asked, "Who is that?" "Humphrey Braden was a friend of my grandfather's. He worked for the OSS in World War II. He told me almost his whole story before he died in a nursing home in North Bergen," Duke said, smiling. "But you didn't," said Joanna. She had read all of Duke's writings. "Some stories should not be written," Duke said. Joanna, a good student, never forgot her lessons, and in an attempt to get Duke to talk, she asked, "What is the OSS?" Army Intelligence was a group that worked in World War II. Then the CIA took over, Duke said, putting his hands in his pockets. "Oh, I see," Joanna said, raising her eyebrows. "Those guys didn't have college degrees or satellite or webcam information. Everything they learned was learned through trial and error and hard experience. That's why I always do what the old wolf told me," Duke said with appreciation in his voice. As they followed 10th Street North, they were moving along the west side of the sidewalk to the left. There were thin trunk trees here that grew wider as they rose. Up ahead, there was a large movement and a large crowd in front of a 4-story building with a concrete base and brickwork. Traffic had begun to move slowly and the road was crowded. From where he stood, Duke could see the lights of ambulances and police. "What's going on?" Joanna asked curiously, standing on her toes. Duke shrugged, frowning at the police drone passing overhead. "I think there's been an accident," he muttered. Then, realizing he recognized one of the cops, he said, "Oh, yeah, I know that old cop, Bill Carter. Come on, let's go over." The cops had set up their standard yellow plastic barricade. 10th Avenue was closed to traffic, and they were switching lanes from 55th Street. Approaching the police tape, Duke raised his hand and said, "What's up, buddy?" The policeman who saw Duke was in his 40s, had red hair and blue eyes, was 190 tall and weighed about 190 kilos. He had a deep wound on his left jaw. The stern-faced policeman, who had been injured in the famous New York riot, had complied with the rules that had been implemented since that riot and had donned Kevlar bulletproof vests with shoulder pads. Kevlar was a material consisting of very light carbon-based, very strong fibers. It was invented and patented by the DuPont Company in 1965. Kevlar had long been used in armor, strong rope production, and flame-retardant protective clothing. The material, which had a thread-like structure consisting of fibers that could withstand very high tensile stress, could be woven, turned into fabric, cut, and sewn. His badge was written on the left side of the front of his dark blue bulletproof vest, on his chest, and his badge number was written in large and legible letters on the right side. There were 2 magazine pockets on the right and left sides of his abdomen. His radio's microphone was on his left shoulder where it met his chest. His radio was placed on his right back to balance the weight. "Not bad, old man, how about you?" Bill Carter asked, smiling as Duke approached him. Duke handed the policeman his pack of cigarettes and asked, "Good, we were just out for a walk. What happened here?" Taking a stick from his pack of cigarettes, Bill looked at Joanna with a smile and asked, "We?" "Forgive my rudeness," Duke said, pointing to Joanna. "Joanna Swanson, my intern." "Nice to meet you, ma'am," Bill said, shaking Joanna's outstretched hand, then turning to Duke, he explained, "Don't hit and run." "Oh, helpful New York," Duke muttered, shaking his head, then squinted for a moment at the man being wheeled into the ambulance, his eyebrows furrowed. "What did you say the name of that unfortunate victim was?" he asked, muttering absently. Bill, still looking at Joanna, took a deep drag on his cigarette. He said with a smile, "I didn't say anything, but I think it was Tanner." "Oh, damn it," Duke complained, throwing his head back. "Did you know him?" Bill asked, looking at Duke. "Oh, yes, an old acquaintance," Duke said dryly, as he caught Joanna's eye. She could tell from Duke's expression that Tanner was the man they were meeting tonight. He managed to conceal the lie he had told the police by remaining expressionless. Duke nodded silently, appreciating Joanna for a brief moment. Then, turning to Bill, he asked, "Who hit you?" Bill must have been upset about Duke's dead acquaintance because he acted very cordial and said, "Eyewitnesses say it was a black van. After the crash, the car sped south. We called the patrol, but..." In a soothing tone, Duke nodded affirmatively and said, "I understand. Let me know if anything comes up." "Did he have any family?" Bill asked, nodding in agreement to Duke's request. "Not that I know of," said Duke, his lips curling. "Damn," Duke muttered as he saw Tanner as the stretcher approached. The left half of the man's head was flattened by the force of the blow. Duke continued to mutter and reached into his right pocket. He pulled out his whiskey flask and took a few sips. "I'll be waiting to hear from you, Bill," he said loudly to the cop as he motioned for Joanna to follow him. When Joanna had gotten a few feet away from the policeman, she asked curiously, "What happened? Was that the man we were supposed to meet?" Duke didn't answer Joanna, his mind seemingly elsewhere. For a moment Joanna thought he was deeply affected by the man's death, but a moment later she noticed Perry staring intently at the scene of the accident. Duke nodded, "Yes, unfortunately he was the man we were supposed to meet. Sorry kid, our first story is gone, I'm afraid." He had his hands in his jacket pockets, not wanting Joanna to see him clench his fingers nervously. He made sure to check his surroundings without letting the young woman know. "It's okay, boss. Just the fact that you called me is enough," Joanna said, trying to smile sympathetically, her tone showing that she was completely sincere about the matter. Duke smiled and tapped Joanna on the shoulder. "Well, I'll see you in the morning then," he said, and turned east toward the subway station at 59th Street. "I hate this city," he thought. He looked up at the sky again. He grunted at the clouds and lit another cigarette. A dusty white van was coming down an old country road. The old van, which was traveling on a rare dusty road in upstate New York, within the city limits, had been stolen a few hours earlier. When it reached an old farmhouse, it pulled into a barn next to the farm and stopped. Two people were waiting for the van in the barn. A young man with long hair and a goatee was sitting comfortably on the hay bales inside the barn. He was wearing a t-shirt with a Greek flag printed on it. The short-haired, bearded man waiting just across from him was walking to the van and slapping the long-haired man on the back of the neck and saying, "Get up, you dirty Greek." The Greek sighed and grumbled, "Dirty Turk." At that moment, two people got out of the minibus. One wore a loose black t-shirt over denim, the other a black shirt. The young man in the shirt had long blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, and was an athletic man of 6 feet 9 inches in height. He wore glasses made of a metal similar to round brass. He and his dark, short-haired, African-origin friend, who was a hand-length shorter and thinner than him, unloaded 2 sports bags from the minibus. He slapped his hand on the Turkish men's outstretched hands, hugged them, and opened the bags they had brought him. He looked at the large computer hard drives he had pulled out and said, "Is everything from the library here?" "Every line," the blond young man said, shrugging. The Turk shook his head. "Otto wonders why you used stun grenades." "The watchman went for a night walk, something he has not done for years," the African muttered. The Greek came up to them and said, laughing, "Your misfortune will soon be told like legend." "Yes, we have a lot of complaints about this too," he grumbled, shaking the hand of the young African man. Meanwhile, the Turk took the bags containing the hard disks and handed them to the Greek and said, "Otto wants another job from you." The blond man shrugged, "Whatever the boss wants, whenever he wants." "The man's name is Duke," the Turk said, nodding. "Duke Perry. He works for the New York Times." July 28, Mount Santa Maria de Pantasma, Nicaragua. Seals. Juan Giménez was one of the drug lord José Charte's men. He had served in the Mexican army, then joined the cartel thinking his life was cheap. Now he stood guard on a mountaintop in Nicaragua, watching the stars above him. He could see the stars clearly through the clouds. When he saw the light that looked like a star but was moving among the beautiful scenery, he realized that it was a plane passing by. Many fools like his cousin thought that these lights were satellites. Gimines remembered his cousin Antoine's debt to him, and with a grunt, he lit another cigarette. What Juan Gimines saw was an A320 on a transit flight. Officially, the cargo plane belonging to Airnex was heading from New Orleans to Colombia. It was carrying Nisco oil and Enernex supplies sent to South America. Unofficially, it was carrying U.S. Navy SEALs. The plane slowed down when it reached Nicaragua, using the approaching storm as an excuse, and opened its rear hatch. Just before the hatch opened, a red light came on inside, signaling that they should prepare for the jump. Under thousands of stars in the dark sky, Nicaragua and the ocean beyond were visible. The blue and white flashes among the large clouds ahead were bringing the storm that the Air Force had warned them about and that would reach the region the following evening. The group of 6 people who were preparing for the jump put their hands on each other's shoulders and moved forward, throwing themselves down through the dark void. Before they disappeared into the darkness, the Santa Maria de Pantasma Mountains and Lake Apanas at their foot could be seen through the clouds. In military literature, this was called a halo jump. It was a high-speed, high-altitude jump. There was only the wind and the fluttering sound of the wind blowing the fabric of their uniforms during their fall. The team, which had been free-falling for a long time without using their parachutes, opened their ash-colored parachutes with the warnings given by their altimeters, and their fall slowed down sharply. Only a few birds took off when they landed on the steep mountainous terrain in the dark. Each shadow that landed opened its parachute connections, cocked its weapon as soon as it opened its butt to its shoulder, went into battle, found the location of the others, and immediately joined the small group. The group consisted of 6 people. All were as silent as night. The group leader pointed his hand north and gave the order to advance. 2 people immediately passed him and started advancing in front. The leader of the small group was named Tador Malalan. He had been born in Charlottesville, Virginia. A big man with blonde hair and blue eyes, he stood 6 feet tall and weighed about 200 pounds. Weighing about 220 pounds including his equipment, he made almost no noise as he moved through the forest, earning him the nickname the Ghost. His face was painted in camouflage colors of green and brown, and he was in his 30s. He had a high forehead and a heavy jaw. His eyes, under thick, furrowed eyebrows, were like ice particles in the shadows. The Ghost was carrying an M4 carbine in his hand. The M4 carbine, the weapon resting on his shoulder, was the carbine version of the M16 infantry rifle developed by the American Colt Company. In other words, it was short and light. This weapon was the standard infantry rifle of the United States. Many Army Special Forces used this weapon. The Ghost's M4 had a silencer longer than a hand's length, a laser designator, an LED flashlight, and a scope for short-range fire. They had painted the weapon green to match the forest camouflage a week ago. The Ghost was wearing the old, faded long-shaded field hat he always wore. There was a drawing of Casper drawn as a joke on the back of the hat. But it had almost faded. The man was armed almost to the teeth. He had a .45 HK Mark 23 SOCOM next to his right leg, a long machete on the left side of the bag, and a 6-shot shotgun on the right side. The backpack went from his neck to his waist, moving almost in time with his body. The leader of the group was a broad-shouldered Spanish man of about 5 feet 7. His sharp senses had become even sharper in the jungle. The man was in his early 40s and his name was Salvador Ricardo Sanchez. Ricardo was also a staff sergeant, and although the group called him Old Man because of his age, Ricardo never gave away his age. Ricardo was the group's explosives expert and also the leader. His big brown eyes, baby face and well-formed physique had always served the Spanish non-commissioned officer well in bars. He too carried an M4 with a grenade launcher. Eric was dark, curly-haired, 6 feet 5, and about 120 pounds. He walked with brown eyes that scanned the area for brief moments. He was a handsome man with a hooked nose and dimpled chin. Eric carried an M14 with a silencer. The rifle, which weighed 6.5 pounds with the long-range scope and the bipods, was a 7.62 mm. Eric Borna was an experienced marksman who had made many unofficial impossible shots with this rifle, whose official lethal range was 800 meters. He had been in the SEALs for 10 years. He had served almost everywhere in the world. He too was armed to the teeth and deadly silent. He had been chewing gum for half an hour. On the top of his backpack was a rolled-up sniper camouflage suit. Eric had achieved the rank of staff sergeant in the Navy and joined the SEALs. They called him Bullseye, and Eric had earned the name. Eric was always calm and easy to anger, once a street gang figure in San Diego, now serving his country in the jungles of Nicaragua. He never talked about his past, but those who were still remembered from the streets as the Iceman. Eric Borna had never married, and the ghost thought it was because he didn't want to commit. The ghost checked his GPS again. The SEALs used a unit that was located in their left eye and extended towards their left ear. This unit basically consisted of a transparent glass, an earpiece for the internal radio, and a microphone. A computer was connected to the glass. This computer provided information through images that only the user could see. It was controlled by a simple, touch-sensitive keyboard on the left wrist. With this system, GPS information could be viewed through photographs sent by unmanned aerial vehicles or satellites, and everyone, camouflaged or not, was marked on the screen with a sensor in the frame on the glass. In this way, the personnel using the unit would not fall victim to a well-camouflaged soldier. At the same time, they could learn the location, position, or health status of the team with the sensors in the wristbands they used. A tiny camera on the headset recorded the user's actions so that all reports and movements could be monitored by the intelligence department after the operation. The ghost stopped his team by raising his right fist, and with his next gesture, he spread his group out into the small stream bed. Then he punched the soldier across from him in the shoulder. The person who came was Sergeant Martin Dunn. He was nearly 2 meters tall and had a wide body. His nickname in the team was Tank. Martin's green eyes scanned the forest, as he turned his back to the ghost and knelt down. Tank had a telephone, radio and computer on his back that provided satellite and central communications. Martin was the only one among them, other than the ghost, who had a university degree. He had graduated from the English Language and Literature department and was a well-known football player in the University League in America. No one knew why he had left everything behind and joined the army. Martin, like the others, was carrying an M4 in his hand. The ghost began talking into the satellite phone. Zebra 1, this is Penguin. We're at Alpha 9. Any change in status? He asked. The operator on the other end of the line had a slightly scratchy, mechanical voice. This was due to a digital encryption program for listening devices. Even if someone from the outside managed to find and listen to this line, they would only hear a lot of electronic hissing. The radio operator they connected to said, "No change, you can continue forward." The ghost tapped Sergeant Raymond Harrington, who was standing right in front of him, on the shoulder and said, "We're going, Bear." Harrington was the only man who could match Martin in strength. That's why they called him Bear. The brown-haired man carried a Belgian-made M249. The M249 had been adopted in 1984. The weapon was a 5.56 mm submachine gun. Weighing 10 kilos when loaded, it had a range of 700 meters. Bear's weapon was loaded with a 200-round magazine. Harrington carried 3 more of these magazines. Bear had married last year and had quickly become the first father on the team, having had a child. Only 24, the young man was always chewing mint gum. Bear grinned and nodded. According to the ghost, Bear had joined the SEALs just for the fun of it. The blonde SEAL looked at grinning Bear with concern, shaking his head and muttering, "Idiot." This man's name was Bryant McCorney. The blue-eyed, oval-faced man the team called Doc was the group's medic. He carried an M4 and an emergency medic kit. He had joined the Navy to earn money to go to medical school, but then decided to stay in the Navy. According to the ghost, the doctor was a natural. At 22, he was the youngest member of the group. Bryant started to walk at the back of the group as they moved through the darkness of the forest. An hour and a half after their last conversation with the base, Ricardo noticed that the forest in front of them had suddenly cut off. It was a 20-foot wide dirt road that divided the forest in two. He heard a voice from the eastern flank on the left side of the road. He raised his left fist and stopped the group. The ghost had seen Ricardo's raised hand, and he had warned the others to stop and kneel before he heard the voices coming from the road. The soldiers, walking in pairs, were joking as they passed by. Most of them were undisciplined and relaxed. Although they wore uniforms, some had beards. Some had grown their hair long. One of them was telling a dirty joke in Spanish with a cigar between his teeth. By the time the joke was over, they had already drifted away, the laughter echoing down the road. After making sure the road was safe, Ricardo gave the group the signal to move forward. They continued to move single file through the thick, broad-leaved vegetation. They rarely made any noise, and usually communicated by signs. The ghost paused, checked his GPS again, and moved the broad-leaved plant in front of him to the side. He saw the 2-meter-high white-walled farm. The place they were looking for was right in front of them. The farm of drug lord Victor Salvans had been raided by American and Nicaraguan government forces about 10 years ago, and Salvans and his men had fought for 16 hours until their last bullet. The farm, with some of its walls destroyed, had been abandoned until 2 years ago. But now, with his night vision device, the ghost saw guards at the gate and on the wall. Someone had started using Salvans' castle again. The ghost turned and signaled to Tank. Tank put his left hand behind his waist and took out a long rectangular box from his bag. When he pulled the box out of the way, the box turned into a simple glider with skids extending from the sides. There was a propeller with long wings at the back of the glider. Tank, who made the glider work, threw it into the open area and made it take off. It took off with a barely audible buzz and rose. "The lookout has taken off," the ghost said calmly. It would be their drone, and it would monitor the farmland. The entire group watched the first images. From what the ghost could see, the guards were equipped with body armor and Kalashnikovs. They all carried radios and stood guard in pairs. "Too many guards," Ricardo grumbled, looking at the images the little glider was sending back. Tank nodded and said to the ghost, "Boss, looks like a lot of people have been here since the last satellite shots." Ghost growled and signaled for Tank to contact the base. When the link was established, he said, "Zebra 1, Penguin requesting air support." The mechanical voice simply replied, "Roger that, Penguin. Air support is on its way." The building looked like it had been built in the style of the original colonists, but it was at most 20 years old. The whitewashed building had been somewhat neglected during its time in the empty area. The 2-story building was a large rectangle, 50 meters by 20 meters. Its high arched roof kept snow out of the roof in the winter, which was important in this steep mountainside area. The 1-meter-wide windows were 2 meters high, with semicircular tops. Most of the square-framed windows had white sills and wooden shutters. At the front of the building were 2 balconies, one on the left and one on the right wing of the ground floor. Both were packed with sandbags and armed with 12.7 mm Browning Mk heavy machine guns. These guns fired bullets as thick as an adult's thumb, with very high destructive power. The second floor had a long balcony, where 2 guards constantly paced. The building must have been newly occupied because there were no cameras visible around. The large garden was surrounded by a 2-meter protective wall. The narcotics forces were able to enter the well-protected building by destroying the western wall with a tank. There was a 50-meter area between the wall and the large villa. Although there used to be many garden plants in this area, neglect and the harsh winter conditions had killed most of them. Only a few fruit trees remained. In front of the villa, there were 2 large swimming pools on either side of the road. These were currently empty. Although the images from the glider showed a large box in the western pool, they could not understand what it was right now. Behind the villa, 2 more buildings were built symmetrically towards the corners. The one on the west wing of the single-story buildings was the servants' quarters, and the one on the east wing was the garage built by the drug lord for his car collection worth a fortune. There was a helipad in the middle of the 2 buildings. The ghost sent Tank and Bullseye to the northern cliff, which was a suitable hill for the marksmen, so they could have support while entering from the ruined wall in the west. Tank would assist Bullseye, the marksman, with his wide-angle binoculars and the images sent by the ghost. Climbing the hill, Tank and Bullseye took out their sniper camouflage clothing that was rolled up in their bags. These clothes changed according to the structure of the region and the vegetation. They were basically fabrics and threads tied to a large porous fabric and made to resemble plants. The hill they were positioned on was a protrusion of rocks, about 15 meters high. The farm walls were about 150 meters away on the sloped area that increased towards the mountain peak. Bullseye unclipped his scoped M14 and settled onto the ground. After a brief moment of examining the farm and its surroundings, he said to the last tank, "If you're ready, let's begin." Normally cheerful, Bullseye's voice would turn cold when his finger touched the trigger. Tank had made a mistake once and asked why, and Eric had replied, "Killing is serious business." Tank checked all the guards again, touched the button on his radio and said, "We're ready, boss." The ghost's voice was heard clearly in his ears, "Let's begin." Tank touched Bullseye's waist and said, "2 guards in front of the western wall. Start with the one on the left." The guard on the left fell to the ground while the one on the right only heard the whine of bullets. He was explaining that he wanted to get married next year but that it would be very expensive. Although they were fully equipped, their training was not as good as the guards inside the house. Most of them were inexperienced villagers or young men from the poor neighborhoods of the city with no future. That's why the young man who heard the sound of a bullet whizzing through the air didn't understand what was happening. He spent the precious 1.5 seconds he could have taken cover to understand why his friend had fallen to the ground, when he suddenly fell to the ground with a blow to his head and was engulfed in darkness. Seeing that both guards were dead, Tank said, "Now the tower, northwest wing first." The tower on the north wing was the closest to them. There were 3 other towers besides this one. A sudden whirring and crashing sound caused the guard to collapse where he stood. "Good," Tank said calmly. "Now, southwest tower," he said. The ghost mobilized his group when Tank said, "The west wing is clear." The 4-man team that would enter the house wore special operations helmets, similar to those used by skateboarders. Night vision equipment was mounted on the front. As the ghost advanced, Bear followed closely behind. Ricardo and the doctor made up the second group. When they reached the broken section of the west wall, the ghost motioned them to take cover behind it. When the group had their backs against it, the ghost tapped on his radio and said, "Tank? There are 3 guards in front of the house and 2 behind them. We didn't touch the towers on the east wing," Tank said from his position on the cliff, looking at the images sent by the glider and through his binoculars. At that moment, Bear squeezed the ghost's shoulder and pointed to his ear. When the ghost turned his attention, he heard a scream coming from inside the building. The owner of that scream was Jason Brucham. 32-year-old Jason Brucham had been kidnapped when he came to Nicaragua to inspect an office for his company. The Free Nicaragua militia had announced that Brucham was a CIA agent and would be executed next week. Of course, the U.S. State Department had immediately denied this. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, the State Department spokesman was telling the truth. Brucham did not work for the CIA, he was a DEA agent. The DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration, was the United States Narcotics Agency. The agency responsible for domestic and foreign narcotics operations had unparalleled sources of information on pharmacology and narcotics. Brucham had come to form a counterterrorism team for the Nicaraguan government and had been caught there. Apparently, there were some in the Nicaraguan government who couldn't keep their mouths shut. "We're going in," the ghost said, cursing through his teeth. Movement had begun, and a noise came from just to their left. The ghost spun around, but a guard who had just rounded the corner fell to the ground with a grunt. "Clear," Tank's voice came into his headphones. As they entered the garden, the kitchen door on the west side opened, and Bear drew his SOCOM 45 to keep quiet and shot the man in the forehead. When the other guard, who came up behind them, opened his mouth to scream, another 45 entered his throat and exited through his neck, knocking him to the ground. When the group reached the kitchen door, Tank said, "There's movement on the front balcony." Ghost and Brain entered with their silenced M4s. They scanned the area with their rifle butts on their shoulders and aimed, while Bear and Ricardo pulled the bodies through the kitchen door and closed it behind them. There were 2 entrances to the kitchen. The first door led to the front of the house, the second door led to the utility rooms at the back of the house. As they sent the first group toward the front of the house, Ghost squeezed Bear's shoulder and said, "Follow me." Brucham's scream came from behind this door. He tapped the latch on his radio and said, "Remember, our mission is to retrieve the package." A terrifying scream cut off the Spanish music coming from behind the door in front of him. Without hesitation, Bear laid down on the floor and looked through the gap between the door and the floor and raised 4 fingers. 3 fingers pointed to the left, the next finger to the right. Standing up, Bear readied his weapon and nodded to Ghost. Ghost showed Bear the stun grenade he had prepared in his left hand. Grinning, Bear opened the door and watched as the Ghost threw the stun grenade inside, then he said, "Explosive," and retreated behind the wall. They were inside in an instant with the shock blast. They had converted the kitchen's storage room into a simple torture chamber. A lifeless man was lying on the floor. It was Jason Brucham, who was tied to the metal frame of a bed against the wall with metal handcuffs. The man was unrecognizable. Almost all of the skin on his right chest had been removed. A scalpel was lying on the right side. The Ghost turned quickly to the left, his hand already on his gun, and shot the first man in the forehead. The other turned toward the back door and the third fell to the ground. The man who ran toward the back door was knocked to the ground by a bullet that entered the back of his neck and exited above him. The man on the ground had drawn his gun at the time, but was knocked to the ground by 2 bullets that entered the side of his head. Immediately after him, Bear said, "Clean." He hadn't seen a door there before. The main reason for this was probably that they had hidden it by building a cabinet over the door that opened into a cellar. The man on his left was wearing a white lab coat and a mask that completely covered his face. He was holding hundreds of pages and folders in his left hand. Behind the mask, a confused middle-aged man was looking at him in surprise. The confused man had a light-caliber pistol on his waist. The man looked around in panic for a moment, said something muffled behind the mask that Bear couldn't understand, and reached for his gun. But Bear was a trained SEAL. He took a quick half-step and elbowed his masked opponent in the full-face mask. The mask shattered and the man tumbled backwards towards the stairs behind the door. The papers in his left hand scattered in the air. Bear was hesitant to shoot the man. The SEAL's primary mission was to rescue the hostage. These types of officers were valuable sources of information. At best, he should have neutralized him and taken him back to base. However, when he saw armed men wearing lab coats just like the man who had fallen to the ground coming from the bottom of the nickel stairs, he cursed and pulled the trigger of his M4. As the men who were shot tumbled back down the stairs, Bear saw a grenade in the hand of the man at the back. "This won't happen, son of a bitch," he said, emptying his magazine into the man's face and closing the door. As he said bomb, Bear hid behind the wall and dropped to one knee, and saw the cabinet topple over with the muffled explosion behind him. The Ghost was saving Jason Brucham at the time. He had mechanical pliers in his hand. These pliers, which worked with a hydraulic system, easily cut the steel chains between the handcuffs. While he was getting rid of the first handcuff, Bear came to the rescue. Brucham's jaw was probably dislocated. They had gouged out one of his eyes, and the top of his other eye was swollen from the blows he had received. 2 fingers from his right hand and 3 fingers from his left hand had been cut off, and his nails had been pulled out. The man, who seemed to have fainted, suddenly came to, grabbed the Ghost's bulletproof vest strap, and said, "Viktor Polanov. Too many. Too many. They will destroy the world, only to rebuild it." While his remaining eye was large and shaking as if it had been skinned. After a moment, he paused and rose up, disappearing from the pupil of his eye. He went into shock, Bear cursed, frowning as the agent collapsed, shaking. "Doctor, you're needed here," he said, tapping his Ghost radio. The doctor and Ricardo had fallen into a great chaos with the explosion. The place they entered was a large hall. Normally this was a hall that opened to the entrance, but they had divided it with portable screens, almost turning it into a labyrinth. The doctor, who was advancing silently, had become even quieter when he saw the patients lying in plexiglass cabins within these compartments. However, the doctor approached one of the men lying on their beds and checked his condition. The man tied to the bed was 5 feet tall and quite thin. The man was tightly tied to the bed with plastic construction clamps. There were cuts and wounds in the places where they were tied, and they were bruised and infected. The man's muscles were tense even while he was being put to sleep. His muscles were constantly contracting in bunches, and he was grunting in a way that could be heard behind the thick plastic glass. After seeing that a sedative and another serum was being administered, the doctor moved away from the man. He was shaking his head from side to side at Ricardo, who was looking at him when he heard the bear say, "Explosive." From his radio, and the sound of the shock bomb echoed in the building. The doctor heard Ricardo firing his silenced M4 while he was fighting hand to hand with a militiaman who had jumped out from the panel in front of him. Not all of the panels were occupied by patients, but also by the guards. While he was knocking down the weak Nicaraguan who attacked him with a single blow of his rifle butt, another one hit him from behind with a stool. Stumbling forward, the doctor saw a thin, tall man in boxers and undershirts emerging from between the panels. A commando knife flashed in the man's hand. While the doctor was leaning forward, he crossed his arms to avoid the knife that was trying to stab him in the chest and prevented it by leaning his arms on the wrist of the hand holding the knife. In the meantime, he grabbed the wrist hard and powerfully as he continued to move forward rapidly. When his helmet hit the man's chest, he quickly lifted his body up. This movement resembled the movement of a person trying to get out of the water in a pool. As the man's face came to the rising upper part of the helmet and scattered, he turned the wrist he was holding towards his opponent and hit the handle of the weapon with the palm of his hand, causing the knife to sink into his enemy. As the man was about to back away with a wet gurgle, she grabbed him by the neck and threw him towards her enemy, who was attacking him from behind. While the man, who had not expected this move, was collapsing to the ground with his dead friend, another man emerged from the darkness and grabbed the doctor by the throat. At that moment he heard the ghost's voice saying, "Doctor, you are needed here." The doctor hissed through his teeth, "I'm a little busy right now," he said. He was still struggling with the same man. The man in front of him had let go of his throat, grabbed his rifle with both hands, and headbutted the doctor in the face. However, the doctor, who had received much more brutal training in the Navy, did not hesitate. He pressed his hand against the man's face, drew his gun with his right hand, and put it under his enemy's chin and fired 2 shots. In the meantime, he saw another shadow emerge from around the corner, turned his gun, and pulled the trigger. As the man who was shot fell to the ground, another person coming from behind the young commando wrapped the electric cable in his hand around the doctor's throat and pulled him back. The doctor grunted, using the wall in front of him as strength, pushed himself back towards the enemy behind him, and together they hit the kitchen wall with a loud bang, the wall made of plaster shattering as it could not withstand the heavy blows of the 2 large men. The doctor, who fell to the ground with a loud noise, turned and faced his enemy. His gun had flown from his hand, but the M4 was still attached to his chest strap. His enemy had picked up a knife from the counter he had rolled onto, but the doctor had no time to waste with this sort of game. He used the M4 to pierce 3 holes in the man's heart, a finger's width apart. One of the militiamen who had woken up from the explosion had taken advantage of the chaos and pulled Ricardo between the panels. He had a 9mm Barrett 92F in his hand. While Ricardo was aiming the barrel of the Barrett to the right, the man fired 3 shots in succession. However, none of them hit Ricardo. Ricardo was an experienced commando. First, he elbowed the man in the face, then he thrust the knife he carried behind his waist under his enemy's chin. He didn't have enough time to draw his gun or open enough space to use his rifle. He had to let go of his knife because another man was attacking him from behind. The one who attacked him slid to the side, bent over, grabbed his pants above the knee and lifted them, knocking him to the ground. He grabbed another man coming from his right by the waist and threw him to the other side, hitting the man's throat with his heel and crushing his windpipe. When the man he had thrown tried to get up from the ground, Ricardo shot him with his M4 to put an end to this chaos. He emerged from between the panels and jumped through the ruined kitchen wall. Hearing the bear's warning, "Explosive," Bullseye whispered, "Damn." A momentary flash of intense light was visible from where they were. Even though there was no sound from the shock bomb, a rush started in the villa and its surroundings. After that, Tank started talking in a series. The scope in his hand was wider angled to help Bullseye, who was the marksman. Tank was indicating the targets to Bullseye. 3 people came out of the garage to the east, he said. Bullseye turned his M14 sharply to the left, sighted his targets, and pulled the trigger 3 times, 3 seconds apart. With each shot, one of the militiamen who had come out of the garage fell to the ground. But in the meantime, there were also people coming out of the West Wing dormitories. Seeing them, Tank said, "West." 6 people coming out of the dormitories. "There's too many sons of bitches," Bullseye said, and he had already shot the first one. But he knew that no matter what he did, several would make it to the kitchen door. Tank noticed this, too, and pressed the button on his radio and said, "Ghost, your guests are advancing on the kitchen door." As he said this, Bullseye had shot another one. When Ricardo and the doctor returned to the kitchen, a window outside broke and the body of a dead guard fell inside. Tank's voice came over their radio. "The ghost is advancing on the guest's kitchen door," said the young man. Ricardo tapped the doctor on the shoulder and said, "I have the back door, you go to the ghost," and he went behind the kitchen counter where he could resist comfortably. The first unlucky Nicaraguan militiaman to kick in the door was armed with an automatic shotgun. Before he could pull the trigger, Ricardo shot him in the chest, knocking him to the ground. Another one came right after him, falling victim to Bullseye's M14. The bullet entered behind his left ear, shattering his right cheekbone and part of the wall. The man, who had lost consciousness silently, hit the door jamb and collapsed on top of the other body. "What a mess," Ricardo muttered, grinning. The doctor pressed the latch on his radio before entering the back room from the kitchen. When he entered the room, he was first confronted by the ghost, who had positioned himself guarding the door. The ghost pointed to Bruchum, who was in shock. He was standing over the man, who was still shaking on the floor. He was looking down through the door behind a broken cupboard, checking down through the doorway. The doctor, who had come to Bruchum's rescue, checked the vitals of the agent they had come to rescue. The man did not look well. Cursing, he injected the emergency concoctions he had extracted from his medical kit into small tubes and connected in 4 to his arm. He dropped the 4th into Bruchum's chest, ignoring the bullets that were screaming through the air above his head, and placed the unconscious man's arm on top of the 4th. He sprinkled blood-clotting powder on his fingers and open wounds and said, "Boss, we can't save him if we don't get him out of here fast." At that moment, Tank's voice appeared on the radio and said, "Boss, air support is approaching." "Roger, keep the west exit open," was all he said, tapping his ghost radio. "Should I check down there?" the bear asked, turning toward the ghost. There was no movement after the explosion. The ghost shook his head and said, "There's no time, we're leaving." Then he tapped his radio again and asked, "Ricardo, how are you?" Ricardo checked the window and the living room from where he had taken cover and said, "They're not firing from the living room side. I don't think anyone wants to break through the boxes." Bullseye cleared out the ones by the kitchen door. The ghost looked at the doctor curiously. The doctor shook his head. "There are people in plastic boxes inside, test subjects, I think," he said distastefully. The ghost pointed to the papers and said to the bear, "Collect them." Then, turning to the doctor, he asked, "How bad is it?" "Worse than Syria," the doctor said as he did final checks on the wounded agent. The bear spits on the ground and growls, "Nothing could be worse than Syria." The ghost just shook his head. They had gone to rescue American doctors without borders in the Syrian civil war and had gotten lost in the chaos of a civil war in which both sides were brutalized. When they returned, it had taken months for each of them to recover. Turning his attention back to his work, the ghost asked, "Bullseye, what's your status?" "To check on the other group." "We're under fire," Eric said calmly. His voice was like that of a man who's tired of the sun at a picnic. They had moved behind the rock where they'd settled. Occasional bullets hit and bounced off the rock behind where they were hiding, sending dust and rock particles flying as the bullets changed direction and whined away. Their enemies were in the area between the villa and the rock. They were using 2 small rocks as cover, trying to surround Tank and Bullseye. Tank took the men coming from the west flank under heavy fire with his M4 again, forcing them back to where they'd taken cover. The 3 militiamen on the east side where Eric was had learned to act more sensibly after their friend was shot in the head with a single bullet. When the fighting got intense, Bullseye and Tank came across a patrol. The team, under heavy machine gun fire, had to hide behind the rock. The mechanical voice of the command center echoed through Tank's headset, "Penguin, Predator and Zone, we're handing over control." Overwhelmed by the dirt that was flying at him, Tank cursed, "Roger that, Zebra 1. We're taking over." Tank moved to a more protected area, tapped Eric on the shoulder, and said, "Cover me, man." Bullseye just grunted and looked to the side. Tank had pushed back. The first man to try to get out with his covering fire was shot in the throat. However, he was thrown back in the process. Tank, who had made the connection to the UAV, had not noticed this. He took control of one of the two UAVs sent to the first area with the connection. The first rocket hit the patrol surrounding them. Tank, who was shaking with a huge sound and heat wave, looked at Bullseye. Bullseye had turned back to the rock where he had taken cover. He was pulling out the binoculars on his M14. The binoculars had shattered. Bullseye reconnected and fired another guided round at the soldiers gathered in front of the villa, then at the ones heading towards the west flank. Each guided round fired was a thin, compact munitions with the power of about 100 dynamite. Polyak 240A Predators, unmanned aerial vehicles almost the size of an airplane, had been in use for about 10 years. The polycarbonate-bodied vehicles had two propeller engines and were capable of vertical takeoff and landing. The Polyak 240A, which had tracking and attack capabilities, also had silent flight capabilities. With an 18-hour continuous flight endurance, it was ideally suited for this task. It could carry 20 of these munitions. The tank pressed the firing button again and said, "We've woken everyone up now." July 28, New York, USA. Paul Carson. New York Police Department Homicide Detective Paul Carson was a tall, olive-skinned, athletic man in his late 40s. He was considered handsome with his strong features, high cheekbones, and blue eyes. The man with the shaved head, goatee, and glasses looked at the file in his hand with a tired expression as his partner Peter Hammond said, "Scott Donovan, 15 years old, from New York. The only son of George Donovan and Patricia Donovan. His mother, Patricia, burned the house down while she was high this year. She died of smoke inhalation in the fire, and Scott was partially burned trying to save her. Social services released him to his father, George. George is 45, an attorney at Thomas and Duwall Construction. I just spoke to him, he is on his way to the hospital. We are waiting for him for questioning." The boy's older brother, Stephen, is from George's first marriage. The boy was left with his father after his divorce, he said from the viewing area next to the interrogation room. One wall of the small room they were in was set up with a fake mirror so that they could watch and listen to the interrogation room. They were watching Scott Donovan leaning on the table in the interrogation room. The boy's clothes and hands were covered in his brother's blood. When the police officers saw him like this, they took the boy into custody, which caused an angry reaction from many students at the school. For the last 2 hours, students, parents of students and reporters had been calling the police station. "Single father and 2 traumatized kids?" Paul asked with a sigh. In response, his partner shrugged and said, "Life is hard." "Yeah, it's harder for some people," Paul said, looking down at the file in his hand. Peter had read the file when Paul came in. Scott was arrested twice while he was living with his mother in Queens. He was released on parole, he said. "Auto theft and home invasion," Paul grumbled, reading the contents of the file. Peter nodded, indicating the notes at the bottom of the file. "What's that supposed to mean?" Paul asked, raising an eyebrow. Peter said, "He didn't steal the car, he just opened the door and fell asleep inside. The same thing happened with the house. The owners were on vacation. They called 911 when they saw the house being broken into. When the police caught him, he was sleeping on the couch, nothing was stolen. The owners withdrew their complaint, but..." Paul finished his sentence, which he left unfinished, by saying, "But he got into the system once." Peter nodded. "Yes, that's right," he said. The mayor's assistant called the chief of police. He released the security footage and YouTube videos on the news. So it went to the media. "We can't parole Scott. We need to get him out of here before he gets victimized any further." Paul laughed, scratching the 2-day beard on his face, and said, "I'm the only victim here." I haven't been able to go home for 3 days, I haven't been able to sleep for 4 days. This kid is the unluckiest person I know. Let's really clean him up and send him home," and then he put the file under his armpit and left the room. They encountered Adrian Kowalski waiting for them in the hallway. Gang detectives always had to meet with homicide detectives. Gangs were unforgiving and would often kill each other as punishment. Seeing him, Paul held out his hand and asked, "Hello Kowalski, what's up?" Adrian looked just as tired as he was. Shaking the outstretched hand, the detective asked directly, "Not bad. Is Scott Donovan under surveillance?" "He's in the interrogation room, but his lawyer or family haven't arrived," Peter said, nodding toward the door to the room next door. "Good, do you mind if I question you for a few minutes?" Adrian asked, smoothing his hair and loosening his tie a little. "Yes, it would be a problem," Paul said directly. He said it so quickly and naturally that Kowalski didn't realize for a moment that he was being challenged. "I don't understand?" he said, tilting his head. Paul repeated what he had said. "Yes, it would be a problem. The whole of New York is crazy about this kid, and you plan to question him without a lawyer or his family? What's your problem?" he asked curiously. Kowalski, who was angry at first, relaxed when he realized from Paul's expression that it wasn't personal, and mumbled, he could be a member of a gang. Fighting with Paul wouldn't do any good, so he preferred to settle the matter politically. Paul narrowed his eyes and asked, "Could it be? Is that so?" When Adrian said excitedly, "I'll have to question him, Paul, to be sure. This is important." Paul nodded. "You could be called a former cop, my friend. The kid had a bad day today, and if you go after him, it'll blow up on you. If he's a gang member, he'll be in your hands soon. But today, the conscience of New York protects him. It doesn't matter who he's protecting." "You don't even know who that bastard is," Detective Kowalski growled, rubbing his hand over his face with an irritated expression. "Really? Who is it?" Paul asked, raising an eyebrow and crossing his arms in front of his chest. About a year ago. The city had changed a lot after the New York riots. Every NGO that had supported the rebels had been destroyed by the state in one way or another. Some had been raided by the FBI, some by the DEA, and some had been so battered by the media that they could no longer even open their doors. However, this had an unexpected result. The loss of trust in the state and the expulsion of NGOs from the city had brought gangs and organized crime back to the city. 6 gangs divided Queens. The most feared of these gangs was the Black Monkeys. The only group that could stand against the gang, which was mostly African, was the Icemen. Each gang dominated its own neighborhood, and gang members dressed in their own style to show their loyalty to their gang, just like soldiers. The young Hispanic man, wearing a loose white t-shirt over loose denim pants, had wrapped his ice blue bandana around his left wrist, indicating that he was one of the Icemen. The broad-shouldered, tall man had many gold and silver chains around his neck. He was sitting comfortably in an old chair with his 1960s Ray-Ban glasses. There was a lamp directly above the man sitting in the armchair. The lamp illuminated the armchair and a few meters around it. There were many eerie shadows around the illuminated area. A few of these shadows moved uncomfortably. There was complete silence in the old warehouse they were in. "What do you think, Carlos?" the young man asked, nodding coyly at one of the many shadows in front of him. "Why are we listening to this bastard, Domingo?" Carlos Gerta asked. The young man, who had just entered his 20s, regularly shaved his head and braided the beard on his chin. Like the man on the couch, he wore a loose t-shirt and loose shorts that came below his knees. The bulge at the waist of his t-shirt showed that he was armed, just like the others. "If you have a better plan, we can listen to you," Domingo said, leaning forward slightly. His face began to be in shadow as he leaned forward. "But the question is not whether or not to listen to him. Whether or not there is a flaw in the plan," he said, then without losing his calm demeanor. But the harshness in his voice was familiar to everyone. Carlos, who could more or less guess what would happen to him after that tone, grumbled and backed away a little. Another big Spaniard stepped forward and put his hand on Carlos's shoulder. "A perfect plan, Domingo," he said softly. As he got closer to the light, the intricate tattoos covering his body began to show. Most of them were depictions of demons from various cultures. The big man, who had shaved his head like Carlos, had several earrings in his left ear. His name was Marcel Hillergy. Marcel didn't talk much, he didn't need to. He was one of the most feared Icemen. Because Marcel was Domingo's killer. "The problem isn't the goodness of the plan. It's the person who brought it," he said, nodding at the small shadow behind Domingo. The shadow shifted uncomfortably, and Domingo raised his right hand and motioned for the man behind him to come closer. From the shadows, the tired face of Scott Donovan emerged as he approached Domingo's old red chair. His eyes were sunken, with small bags under them. He was quite thin and hunched over. Yet there was no fear in his eyes. "The plan is good," he said in a scratchy voice. "The Icemen will go in and out of the warehouse. No one will die, and since no one did, it will only be a robbery. If you follow the list and order I told you to, only the robbery squad will be involved. If you dress like I told you, the cops who deal with the gangs will go after the black monkeys. You can make 200,000 or 300,000 on this," he said. Marcel narrowed his eyes. "What's your gain in this? Why are you in this?" Scott slowly raised his right hand and raised his thumb. "I have a drug addict mother." His index finger was added to the thumb. "She's on medication because she has stage 3 cancer and can't stand the pain anymore." His middle finger was added to the other 2 fingers, "And now I want to be strong too." Domingo said that if the plan goes well, I can join the Iceman. If you think I'll betray you, or that this is a trick, you know very well where I live with my mother. I'll be there. Carlos stepped forward. "You're joining us? As what?" Scott tilted his head to the side and smiled slightly. "Let's face it. I won't make a soldier. If you send me to collect, he'll look at my appearance and come to take over the gang," he said, which caused a lot of nervous laughter in the warehouse. Waiting for the laughter to stop, Scott said, "But I make good plans, and good plans will make you rich." "You want to be consigliere," Domingo said, leaning back. "I'm not a lawyer, but that's the gist. If you prove yourself, you will be Whiteman." Even New York nights were never silent, they were simply buried in its hum. The sounds of cars, wind, and people echoed off the gray walls of the tall concrete towers, turning and evolving. The meeting was finally over, the Icemen had dispersed. Scott was walking wearily toward his home. 6 times he had been shot, 8 times they had promised to kill him painfully. As he walked down the dark alley, he turned back at the sound of a voice coming from behind him. He leaned forward and raised his hands to face level. The young man saw a small movement in the dim light. It was a cat, looking for something to eat among the abandoned garbage. Scott straightened up and sighed nervously when he saw the silhouette at the end of the street. The silhouette must have seen him because he lit a cigarette. Scott walked leisurely to the exit of the street, next to the silhouette. Without looking at him, he said dryly, "Everything will be prepared as you wish. On Wednesday, the Icemen will rob the Hector and Konex drugstore in the Bronx." "That's a good one, son. Your mother will be proud of you," said the shadow in an amused tone, taking a deep drag on his cigarette. "When are you going to release him?" Scott asked, clenching his teeth and fists. "She was delivered to your house a few minutes ago. But I suggest you get rid of her, son." "That woman is finished," the man said, pressing on him as he dropped his cigarette on the ground in a dejected manner, and with a friendly pat on Scott's shoulder, he walked out onto the main street. Scott glared with unconcealed anger after the departing Adrian Kowalski. July 28, Louisiana, USA. There are 3 ways to do a job: the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. The command building of the 104th Logistics Command was a 2-story reinforced concrete building. Agent Carter watched the room she was in with a quiet sigh. Nothing unnecessary was used in the small room, 5 meters by 5 meters. Behind the desk right in front of her was a colonel of medium height, broad shoulders, and a stern look, who shaved his hair with a machine every morning. The green-eyed man was busy signing the reports and files in front of him. There was no sound in the room except for the sound of a ballpoint pen moving over the report papers. When Carter shifted uncomfortably, the creaking of the guest chair caused the colonel to look up. Carter couldn't help but smile, but the man returned to the last report. Carter had to convince himself not to curse through his teeth. Carter was quite uneasy. He couldn't figure out why. At first, he thought it was partly because of the colonel's rude behavior. Then, he realized later that it was because Duncan was acting too relaxed, but it was neither. There were photographs in the waiting room of the building. Every soldier in the photographs that Carter looked at one by one had died. That's why his passport photos were on the wall of honor. Why did the photos of dead soldiers bother him? They had come to the unit with Duncan, and had made an appointment by calling the unit from the FBI headquarters in Texas. Duncan had gone to the bathroom just before going to meet with the colonel, and in the meantime the colonel's secretary, who had arrived, had left Carter alone and let him in. The colonel signed the last report, closed the cover and placed it in its place next to the table. Then, placing his hands, his fingers intertwined, on the table, he said, "I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Agent Carter. What can I do for you?" "James Taylor," Carter said, forcing a smile. "Did he work here? What was his job?" "Yes, James Taylor was working with us. The mission was lost until you found it," the colonel said in a monotone voice, nodding, his green eyes expressionless under his heavy eyebrows. Shaking his head, Carter pulled out his notebook and asked, "So, what was his assignment?" "It was the registrar," the colonel said. At that moment there was a knock at the door and Duncan came in. There was a faint smile on his face. But what caught Carter's attention was the way the colonel straightened up when he saw him. "I didn't know military intelligence was interested in this," the late middle-aged officer grumbled. "We're very interested, Commander." "What was James Taylor's assignment?" Duncan asked as he reached out and shook hands with Colonel Frank Jonas. "Me that too," Carter said with a smile, and Colonel Jonas said, "He was an operator." Carter couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at the colonel in surprise. "Operator?" The colonel shrugged. "Operator is a member of a team with the United States Special Forces, Agent Carter. These guys have been through hell for the United States." Only then did Carter realize what was bothering him. Every photograph on the wall was of men who had died silently for America. Fighting the anger rising inside him, the FBI agent asked, "So where in the hell did James find 6 rods of plutonium? Did you know about that?" The colonel shook his head. "No," he said. "We don't know about the spheres. I looked in his files. He wasn't sent on a mission where he could have gotten to those spheres." "What about teammates?" "They officially died about a year after James disappeared," the colonel said with a sigh, looking at Duncan. "What about unofficially?" Duncan asked, laughing at the answer. The colonel pursed his lips and said, "I wasn't here at the time. But sometimes team members need to disappear," in a tone of reasonable explanation. Duncan nodded. "I understand. We may still need to find them for this plutonium thing. It could be that they were shared and all we find is the bits left for James," he said, offering a possible scenario. The CIA, DEA, ATF, FBI, local law enforcement, and the Army were always competing with each other, sharing information as stingy as possible. But no one wanted a nuclear test similar to 9/11. So the colonel nodded and said, "We will share the team information with you." Checking his phone as he left the base, Carter waved his phone around. "Colonel, real quick. Names of team members." Carter scanned the email and muttered, "James Taylor, Brain North, Gary Mandroom, Thomas Wayne, Edward Duane. They all died in Nicaragua." Duncan said sarcastically, he was ready to give these anyway. He was hoping we'd be content with that. Then he pulled out his own cell phone. "These guys are like family, Agent Carter. They don't give up on each other easily," he said, and called the hospital. After introducing himself to the doctor who answered the phone, he got straight to the point, asking, "Did James Taylor have a visitor?" Smiling at the answer, the experienced man said, "Do you have any security footage?" He winked at the FBI agent. "We're going back to the hospital." They arrived at the hospital at midnight and the deputy director was waiting for them in his office. After greeting the agents, he took them to the archive room where the security records were kept. There were also signature books here. The deputy director, looking at the book, tapped a signature with his finger and said, "Here it is. This gentleman is Mr. Taylor's cousin. He comes every year on his birthday. He stays for a few hours and then leaves." Duncan leaned over and looked at the security footage of the signed date. Smiling at the face on the screen, the agent whispered, "And here's Edward Duane." July 29, Texas, USA. Kazakh Brotherhood. The agents killed in the FBI convoy had been flown by helicopter to headquarters in Texas. 3 technical teams and 2 agents responsible for them were left to investigate the scene. Agent William Jackson was a large blond man who looked sullenly at the dry, warm air. He had left his jacket in his car and rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt. Normally, he would pull his car into the shade and read the newspaper while the teams finished their work, but there was not a single shaded spot here. Paul Gregson, the head of the technical team, handed him a can of Coke. Jackson accepted the cold Coke gratefully and sipped it. Just as he was about to thank Gregson, his partner Sarah Jane Parker arrived. She had the list of agents killed in the raid that she had received from the experts. The woman said absently, "No way." "Maybe," Jackson teased his partner, his spirits lifted by the cold Coke, a genuine smile on his face. The woman with short, curly black hair glared at him and handed the list in her hand to the agent and asked, "Have you seen this list?" "No, what happened?" Jackson asked, still trying to smile. "Jason Stonebrook," the woman said, placing her slender finger on a name on the list Jackson was looking at. "The youngest son of the Stonebrook family." Jackson's smile suddenly disappeared and his face contorted as if he was in pain. "You can't be serious," he growled. The Gregson was a short, thin man with red hair. "Who are the Stonebrooks?" he asked the 2 agents curiously. Jackson put on his sunglasses and said sullenly, "A group whose family business is policing. The oldest is Stephen Stonebrook. A Texas Ranger. He works the old school way, no negotiations, no bribes, no fear, no withdrawal or threats. He chased down Salvador Hernandez's gang that killed the border patrolmen 2 years ago and killed them all." Gregson had been in the gray world of cops for a long time. He knew the myths of cops and what they really were. So he laughed and said, "This is ridiculous. If that happened, the cartel would be after him." Both FBI agents turned to Gregson and shook their heads dramatically. "Trust me, no one wants to mess with the Stonebrook family," Jane Parker said coldly. In the morgue beneath FBI headquarters in Austin, Texas, Coroner Leo Korn stretched and listened to the cracking of his back before cracking open another energy drink. The FBI convoy heading to Fort Griffin had been raided and all the agents had been massacred. The center had been put on alert, and coroners had been brought in from surrounding areas to provide backup. It had taken hours for everyone to finish their work and leave, but Korn was tired not from the work but from the pressure of the politicians. Senators, representatives, his aides, the governor, and the deputy mayors were constantly calling, saying or implying that they were waiting for results. Korn shook his head and mumbled something unintelligible, while behind him a deep male voice said, "What did this to my son?" Korn sprang back, almost like a cat. The slanted-eyed, bald man was about to die of fright. Before him was a 6-foot-tall man wearing a vintage cowboy hat, denim, shirt, and jeans. He was in his late 50s. His thick white mustache hung down to the sides of his lips. There was an expression in his hard blue eyes that he had never seen before on anyone. The man had a Colt 1911 in a leather holster at his waist. A metal Texas Ranger badge hung over his left shirt pocket. Wondering how he had entered this building with a gun, even though he was a Texas Ranger, Korn asked, "How did you get in here?" Wild blue eyes turned to Korn. The Asian swallowed hard and pointed to the young agent's body on the metal table where the autopsy had been completed, RPG, AK-47, and I think a Glock, he said in one breath. Stephen Stonebrook looked at the body of his youngest son, Jason, and took a deep breath before removing his hat. Leaning down, he kissed his son's bald spot and asked, "Did they find out who did this?" Korn shook his head in response to the old man, who was almost 2 handspans taller than him. Stephen shook his head slightly and put his hat back on. His eyes were shadowed by the hat. "We'll come back for him," he said, and headed for the exit of the room. The doctor noticed that the man was not making a sound despite the cowboy boots he was wearing as he walked away. Korn stared at the walking man, then at his trembling hands. FBI Deputy Director Lisa Bennett had been annoyed that her door had been opened without a knock, and she had raised her head angrily to berate the person who had come. But when she saw Robert Stonebrook in front of her, all she could do was swallow. Still, she was not the type of woman who would allow anyone to undermine her authority. The blonde woman was about to speak, her lips drawn into a line of anger when Robert placed his hands on her desk, leaned down so that his face was flush with hers, and said, "I am sorry for your losses, Deputy Director Bennett. The Stonebrook family holds you or your agency responsible for this incident. If you require our assistance, all of the Rangers are at your service," said the brown-haired, blue-eyed man, who was almost a hand's length taller than his father. His thick beard and mustache were trimmed into a goatee. His angular face seemed to symbolize the big man's steely determination and willpower. This was not what Bennett had expected. It was Bennett who had convinced Jason Stonebrook to join the FBI when he was a Texas Ranger. Bennett had expected his brother to threaten him, shoot him, or run him over with a car, not this. Pulling herself together, the woman stood up and said, "I am truly sorry for your loss, Ranger Stonebrook. If you would like, I can escort you to Jason. That way they won't have to stop you and bother you at the morgue." "Thank you, Assistant Director. My father has already seen my brother and said goodbye to him. My brother and I will only be able to look at Jason's face after we find who shot him," Robert said as he reached out and shook her hand. He tipped his hat to the woman and left the room as quickly as he had come. Bennett's eyes widened, then his brow furrowed as he realized what Robert Stonebrook meant. He went out into the hallway and shouted after the Texas Ranger, "Stonebrook. This is a federal matter. If you try to get revenge, I'll arrest you." Robert Stonebrook walked up to his father outside the building, smoking a cigarette, and without saying anything, he simply tapped the old man on the shoulder. The old man followed his son, who continued walking without saying anything. The short-haired, broad-shouldered young man wore a black t-shirt, black denim, and white-soled canvas sneakers worn by skateboarders as he looked at the 2 Rangers who had gotten into a black, 4-door Ford Ranger waiting at the corner of the building. He had 3 piercings in his left eyebrow and 5 earrings in each ear. He had braided his nearly hand-length goatee. When Stephen looked at the young man watching them, the young man rolled up the open windows of the car and turned on the radio. He could hear FBI Assistant Director Bennett speaking on the radio. Stephen nodded appreciatively. "Good work, Harvey," he said to the young man with the goatee. "We couldn't have done this if Robert hadn't put that bug in Bennett's room, Dad," Harvey Stonebrook shrugged, Robert putting his finger to his lips. They were now listening to the Assistant Director of the FBI. In the morning, another van replaced the Ford Ranger and resumed recording. The van would be occupied by Jeremy Hawkins, a family friend who had taken leave after hearing of Jason's death. Hawkins was a Ranger himself, and was considered family. The Ford Ranger sped toward the interstate. They had been listening to the FBI all night. The FBI was certain there was a leak, but there was considerable debate about its source. The only tangible clue was a name several agents had mentioned when reporting to Bennett, Rojas. Rojas was a Brazilian, and the man was running weapons. Salvador Rojas was sitting comfortably in his jacuzzi watching NBA game replays. His life was going well. He had come to one of the best villas in the backstreets that formed the border of the Forgotten City. His triplex villa was worth a few $1,000,000. He was no longer selling .38s in the backstreets. Last month, he had sold anti-aircraft guns to an African republic. The young man with a tan skin said to his Mexican girlfriend, Talia, "Get another beer from the fridge, baby." He was a short man with a broad face. He loved to show off so much that he had not even removed his gold and platinum chains, which were as thick as a child's wrist, from the blinds. The man who was caught by his chains was thrown into the jacuzzi with an irresistible force. When the young man came out of the water when he was almost drowning, he saw Stephen Stonebrook in front of him. Robert had caught him and the man roughly dunked Salvador back into the water. After experiencing this many times, Salvador begged, "Stop. Please. What do you want?" But it was Robert who spoke. "The Fort Griffin raid," he said. "I didn't do it. I swear." Salvador said, shaking his head. In return, Robert dunked him back into the water. When he got out of the water, the Cossack Brotherhood. Rohaz said in one breath. "That's their name, the Cossack Brotherhood." Robert lifted Rohaz up from the chains he was holding and said, "How do we find them?" Rohaz smiled fawningly and said, "I had them watched. I mean, in case we needed them later." "He sold the weapons and had them watch him to blackmail the men," Harvey said, laughing. Robert's and Stephen's faces remained the same. "The painting across from the fireplace," Rohaz whined, pointing to the dining table. "The password is 8413. Harvey opened the safe he found behind the painting with the password Rohaz gave him and took the files inside. There were a lot of photos and USB data carriers in the files. When he came back showing the files, Robert loosened Rohaz's throat and nodded for him to continue. Swallowing hard, Rohaz said, "We followed them to Oakwild Airport. There were a lot of soldiers there. Former soldiers, that is. We followed them too. Most of them were going to and from the Black Wolf Company." Harvey took out the photos, looked at them one by one and then showed them to the others. Stephen nodded to Robert and said, "Let's go." As Harvey emerged from the bathroom, he heard Rohaz struggle and Robert snap his neck. The Stonebrooks were on the move. From now on, there would be only destruction and death. July 29th, Manhattan, New York, USA. The price of sins. Nexco Oil's security chief Alan Darcy was a big man, 6 feet tall, blond, and blue-eyed. The broad-shouldered man wore a dark gray, shiny suit. His golden hair was gelled and combed back neatly. He had a gray Mercedes, just like his suit, and he was driving it himself, as usual. Darcy, who was driving through the night, had come to Chinatown as he did every Wednesday. The 2-story building was the shortest and most eye-catching among the other 7 or 8-story concrete buildings. The red-painted building's outline was marked with red LEDs. The Mercedes entered the parking lot behind the building, passing through an entrance manned by 4 professional bodyguards. This street in Chinatown was completely under Juan Jin's control. Paparazzi and police could not easily enter this street. He entered the Juan Heaven Club, where only special guests were allowed, through the back door as usual. The club was built in the style of ancient Chinese mansions. The man who opened the door decorated with red dragon reliefs with a smile and tipped the housekeeper who greeted him with a few $100s with his manicured hands, headed towards the room that was always reserved for him. The man who climbed the red carpeted stairs, the blonde who climbed to the first floor among the crowd of images with red patterned wallpapers and decorations hanging from the ceiling, turned left on the floor he knew well. There were 16 black doors in the long and narrow corridor. Each door had magnetic locks specific to the customers. These locks could only be opened with the cards that the customers and the house manager had. The man who reached the last door opened the door with the magnetic card he took from the inside pocket of his jacket with his usual smiling face. The large room was filled with mirrors and LCD televisions. The room was generally dominated by red and shades of red. There was a round bed in the center of the room and a large mirror was placed on the ceiling above the bed. There were 2 naked boys lying in the middle of the bed. Their movements were sluggish and lazy. As usual, the children had been given drugs for the first time. Darcy, whose smile grew on her face, noticed an unfamiliar color change on the left side of the room as she went to the bed. When she turned to her left and saw Bakesfield sitting on the single sofa here, the smile on her face disappeared. "What are you doing here?" Alan Darcy said to the tall man who was the vice president of Nexco Oil. The man was sitting comfortably on the burgundy-colored, high-backed, wide, single-seater chair, his back straight as always, and his legs crossed. The fingers of both hands were intertwined at the level of his chin. "What do you think?" he asked the man across from him. "Don't talk nonsense, Alan, you know you have no chance. Besides, if you die here, the disgrace will be immense. Not to mention the reputation your father, Sir Brandon Darcy, will lose in the court," Bakesfield said with amusement as Alan reached into his jacket. Alan's eyes began to twitch with irritation. As Bakesfield watched with amusement, the man said, "What do you want?" "I need a few things." "You're going to provide them for me," Bakesfield said, spreading his hands. "Are you going to kill McCrollins?" Darcy asked, her eyes narrowing. Bakesfield laughed. "Don't be ridiculous. If I kill him, how am I supposed to get my company back? I've never tried, but running an empire from prison can be tough. You and I stand to lose a lot. I want to win. I suppose you do too?" he said, his tone more lingering with answers than questions. "So what do you need?" Alan hissed through his teeth. "You'll find out soon enough," Bakesfield said, rising from his luxurious and comfortable chair and heading for the door. He paused, "And my friend, let's keep this conversation between us," he said, looking at the naked children on the bed. Darcy was shaking with anger. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his silver Browning feg. He turned towards the bed and went to the children who were staring at him with their numb eyes. He picked up one of the pillows and pressed it against the face of the first one, then buried his gun in the pillow and pulled the trigger. The 7.65mm gun made only a muffled popping sound with the pillow pressed against its barrel. July 29, New York, USA. George Donovan. Scott was in his room, the lights off. In the silence, he was sitting in the armchair where his older brother Stephen had sat the night before. In the darkness, he was looking out the window opposite him with his wet eyes at the blank wall of the apartment a few meters away. The few relatives and acquaintances who had come and gone to offer their condolences had now returned home. The reporters had called so many times that his father had unplugged the house phone and turned off the others. The house was now plunged into the ominous silence that Scott knew so well. It was so quiet that Scott could hear his father at the end of the hallway behind the closed bedroom door. George had been pacing the living room for the last hour. Scott looked at his watch again. It was 2 a.m. He got up, took off his bloody clothes without turning on the light, and put on clean clothes. At that moment, he heard his father approaching. He quickly got into bed and covered himself with the blanket. The bedroom door opened quietly. His father checked to see if he was asleep and then closed the door. Scott got up when he heard his father's cell phone ringing and curiously headed for the door. When he started listening without opening the door, his father started talking. "His brother died," George said sadly. Whoever it was paused before answering again. "No, it happened at school." "Yes, Scott is ready. He must go to the foundation immediately." Scott swallowed and walked away from the door. His father wanted to get rid of him. He would be sent to an orphanage or something. He had no objection to being sent away. He didn't have to stay here if he wasn't wanted, but there was something he needed to finish first. He grabbed his backpack from next to the bed and slowly climbed out the window of his room, disappearing into the darkness. New chapter. New York Nights. July 30th, Manhattan, New York, USA. Camilla. Just 40 minutes after arriving home, Duke was curiously knocked on the door and was carrying files about Tanner as he went to the door. Duke was an old-fashioned man. He didn't like modern tablet computers and smartphones. When he looked through the peephole of the door and saw Camilla, he curiously opened the door. "Hey, what's up?" Camilla asked. There was something wild in her gaze. The woman, who never spoke, grabbed Perry by the collar and pulled him to her, pressing her full lips to his. After kissing him passionately for a long time, she grabbed Duke's hair just above the nape of his neck and pulled him back, then said with a wild look, Why not? And kissed him again. Duke grabbed Camilla roughly by the waist and lifted her up into his arms. In the meantime, the woman kissed her repeatedly. Closing the street door, Duke pushed her against the door and quickly removed his jacket. Wrapping his muscular and long legs around Duke, Camilla's breathing changed. She also began to undress Duke with harsh movements. Grabbing Duke's hair, Camilla tilted his head back again and looked into Perry's eyes. When I'm done with you, you'll realize you haven't lived until now, she said passionately. Duke believed every word the woman told him. Police Sergeant Bill Porter had called Duke at 3 in the morning just to have fun. He had known him for almost 10 years and Duke Perry drank every night. He must have been really high at this hour, and when he was high he was a lot of fun. But the mobile phone didn't even ring twice and Bill Porter found Duke very sober. "Porter?" Duke asked from the end of his cell phone. Still stunned, Porter asked curiously, "Perry? Is something wrong?" Perry looked down at his bed and smiled. "No, why do you ask?" "You're sober," Porter said as if that were the answer to everything. "I'm not. I can drink while I work and pretend to be sober while I drink, and of course I was waiting for you to call me," said the Duke, laughing, and when Camilla, who was lying naked in bed, returned muttering, he went towards the kitchen so as not to wake her. "Really?" Bill Porter asked, eyebrows raised. "Indeed," said Duke, pouring some whiskey into his coffee. "You found the car abandoned, didn't you?" Bill turned around and looked at the still burning car and asked, "Yeah, how did you know?" This conversation was getting more and more interesting. "Where did you find it?" Duke asked, ignoring the question. "In the harbor area. The fire department is putting it out now." "Come on, Duke, how did you know?" Bill asked again absently. Duke scratched his chin and took a sip of his coffee. "From the skid marks. When there's a crash, they either hit the brakes before or after the crash." "And there were no skid marks at the crime scene," Bill said, biting his lower lip as he nodded. "Yeah, no skid marks," Duke grumbled, shaking his head with a frown. "So it's murder," Bill grumbled. He hated murder, and he hated this city. July 30th, Manhattan, New York, USA. Abioye Adisa. It was long past midnight, and somewhere in the middle of the hours when the darkness was trying to silence everything, there was Abioye Adisa, who was looking back into the narrow alley. Abioye was a tall, thin African. The alley was a dingy, damp meeting point between two streets. No one would go there without work or courage. Even Abioye thought it wise to stay away from this alley unless he had to. Abioye Adisa was no longer the street vendor he had been. He was protected now and he was making good money. He would not risk his life by doing small jobs. Of course, there were people he could not offend, especially in the dark streets that the honest, day-working people of New York did not know about. The Nigerian man, lost in his oversized hooded jacket, smiled when he saw the young man running toward him. Slowing down as he approached, Scott raised his head slightly in greeting and caught the man's outstretched hand in the air. "You've been gone a long time, my man," the African said in his deep voice. "Things are tough. Cops are everywhere. The waters are muddy," Scott replied vaguely, speaking in a bleak tone and shrugging. Abioye pouted his thick lips and nodded, "Yes, exactly." "You weren't clear on the phone, what do you need?" asked the tall, hunched African, checking the entrances and exits of the street. "Nothing that will seize up," Scott said calmly. "Are you going to pick up girls or solve problems?" Abioye asked. Some people paid attention to how fancy their weapons were. "For these guys," the street joked, "are you going to pick up girls with that?" "I'll solve the problem," Scott said in a cold tone, pulling out a thick roll of dollar bills from his pocket and handing it to a man at least 10 years older than him. Abioye had seen this expression on his face before. But it didn't concern him. After counting the dollars Scott had handed him, he pulled out a Beretta 92S from behind his waist and handed it to him. Scott calmly removed the magazine from the gun and pulled the upper mechanism to check the gun. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing. He looked at Abioye and said, spare magazines. Abioye pulled 3 loaded magazines from inside his jacket and handed them to Scott. "There must be a big problem," he said with a smile. Scott was silent as he put the guns in his bag without looking at him. He left the street without saying anything to the tall African. Abioye shook his head as he watched the young man walk away. "Big problem," he muttered. July 30th, Manhattan, New York, USA. Don't open. Detective Paul Carson had just gotten into bed. His wife and 2 children were on vacation in San Diego. The house was very quiet, and Paul welcomed the silence. Until his phone rang, jolting him out of bed. Looking at the translucent screen of his cell phone, Detective Duke Perry had left a note next to his name: "Do not open." He put the phone down and covered his face with his pillow. The phone continued to vibrate and hum on the nightstand. The detective threw the pillow aside in anger and hissed, "Fucking hell," as he picked up the phone. "It's 3:30 in the morning, Perry, and I just went to bed," Paul said angrily. Perry sounded almost indifferent. "Never mind," the reporter said. "Powell was supposed to call you in 10 minutes anyway." Eric Powell was Paul's boss. Grumbling, Paul pushed himself up on his elbow in bed, took a deep breath, and asked, "Why would Powell be calling me, you goddamned old maniac reporter?" "He thinks the car accident on 10th Avenue tonight was murder," Perry said, sounding amused, laughing at Carson's phrases. "How do you know he thinks that?" Paul Carson asked, pressing his free hand to his forehead, but the cop knew from life's experience that he would hate the answer he got. "Because I told him so," Perry said with a laugh. Sitting up in his bed, Paul asked, "Perry, it's really sweet of you to go out of your way to make my life miserable. I really appreciate it. Is this ridiculous conversation going anywhere?" "Of course he will. I'm giving you time for the murder investigation. You guys are going to take me and my intern with you and you break into Tanner Winslaw's house, that's the deal," Perry said in a friendly tone. "What?" Carson asked, thinking for a moment that he had misunderstood. For some reason this seemed to anger Duke. "Intern? What's wrong? Haven't you seen any interns?" he asked. "Oh, never mind," Paul said, pulling the phone away from his ear to check the signal on his phone. It was Eric Powell. Through gritted teeth, he said, "Fine, hang up." "Powell's calling," and before Duke could say anything else, he hung up. July 30th, Bronx, New York, USA. The ghost. There was no one on the street as Scott walked purposefully. A patrol car had seen him a few minutes earlier, and a pizza deliveryman just before that. That was what New York had become after the riots. It wasn't safe to be out after midnight. There were thousands of horror stories about it. Some spoke of gangs, some of the mafia, some of creatures of the dark. But to the young man, it was all just New York. A dark, rich city nestled between tall buildings. When Scott felt the vibration in his pocket, he pulled out his newly purchased disposable phone. Building on the corner of Walnut and East 137th. 5 people, the man with the thick Spanish accent said on the other end of the phone, and hung up. Scott wiped the phone with his shirt before hitting the first trash can with it, throwing the pieces in the trash. Walnut Street was in the southern part of the Bronx. Lost in the fog coming in from the East River, the area was filled with 1 2-story warehouse buildings. The area was marked on maps as Port Morris. Port Morris had been under Irish control since the rebellion, so Scott was not at all surprised to hear that what he was looking for was here. The young man who had taken a taxi up to the top of the street estimated that there were a few hours left until daylight. The fog was suffocating the streetlights, sucking the light ominously. It was the fog that caused the hissing sound from some of the lampposts. Scott was not 30 yards away when he saw someone standing guard at the entrance to the warehouse at the corner of the street he was driving. So he paused and changed his plan. Robert Tanner turned up the collar of his coat and took a deep drag on his cigarette. The lights of the train passing over the overpass next to the depot illuminated the street for a short while. The big bearded man in his navy coat and newsboy cap almost shouted silently, "I'm Irish." He wore black jeans and thick-soled work boots. When the bearded man with green eyes heard the sound of coins coming from the end of the street, he reached into his coat pocket and turned that way. But the senses, alerted by his tense nerves, told him that what he should be looking at was behind him. The man, who was 6 feet tall, was so fat that with his beard he looked like a North American bear. Turning quickly, the man felt a deep pain in his chest and in the hand he had not yet removed from his jacket. The thin figure standing in front of him had stuck a skewer into his hand. The skewer had practically driven his hand into his chest. The man who had never been helpless before opened his mouth to warn the others when a young boy he had never seen before pushed him back with his left hand and buried the switchblade in his right hand into his throat with his raised jaw. However, Robert Tanner was not an opponent to be easily defeated. Despite the swelling in his chest and the knife in his throat, he managed to hit his opponent with his left hand, albeit sloppily. Scott was thrown against the wall on his left by the heavy blow he received. The switchblade in his hand remained in Robert's throat. He quickly threw himself backwards by placing his foot on the wall he was thrown to. While Robert hit the wall angrily, Scott hit the truck tractor in front of the warehouse. As Robert turned back, Scott stood up determinedly and hit the big man's left knee hard with the sole of his foot, knocking him down on his knee. When Robert extended his left arm to catch him, Scott caught his arm with a harsh move. While Robert grunted with a wet grunt, Scott hit his shoulder with his knee and pulled his arm back hard, dislodging it from his shoulder. In the meantime, Robert managed to pull his right arm away, but it was too late. Scott had regained his grip on the knife he had stabbed in. He pulled his head back and pulled the knife out to either side. Scott's face was emotionless as Robert Tanner's full strength surged through his throat. Angus Hallberg was just coming out of the restroom when he heard the door of the warehouse open. The young man who was zipping up his trousers was short and thin. The dark-haired young man smiled and asked, "Is it cold outside?" And then his mouth suddenly closed. Angus caught the scent of blood for a moment. In an instant, he recognized the face. It was the boy from the news, and the boy from the news stabbed Angus in the chest repeatedly with his switchblade until the young Irishman slid to the ground with a quiet whisper. Scott leaned down and pulled a Glock from Angus' waist. He silently cocked the .45. He had tucked the shotgun he had taken from Robert between his bag and his back. He hoped he wouldn't need it. He made his way silently through the large warehouse, just as he did every night down the fire escape. Music was coming from somewhere in the back of the warehouse. Scott walked toward the music and the lights. On either side were large, industrial-style steel shelves. The steel shelves were lined with large boxes. The boxes bore the logo of a cannery. At the end of this dim corridor he was walking through, there was a table with 3 people sitting around it. All 3 were holding poker cards. Money, chips, empty whiskey glasses and bottles were spread out on the table. Scott walked as easily as if he were walking down his own street. He wasn't thinking about anything at the moment. He just glanced at the others for a moment and saw his target, sprawled out on the couch behind the table. It was Mike Sullivan. He was playing a game on the game console and the giant plasma TV that had been pulled in front of the couch. An empty whiskey bottle was next to his feet. When Scott approached the table, only one of them saw and understood who he was. This was no use to the young blonde man because Scott shot him first. The 2 Irishmen, who looked at their friends who had fallen backwards with 2 holes in their cheekbones and eyes, took 3 bullets in the back of their neck on the left and 3 in the chest on the right. This was a simple, purposeful job, unlike the ones in action movies, and no unnecessary movements were avoided. This was the kind of job someone who was thirsty for revenge would do. Mike Sullivan pushed back in fear, almost climbing the brick wall behind him. He was wearing a red striped Adidas sweatshirt and a pair of baggy denim pants. The crotch of the pants was starting to soak through. The .357 Magnum he had shot Stephen with was lying on the coffee table in front of the couch. Scott looked at Mike, who had peed his pants in fear, with disgust. Mike stammered, "What the fuck are you?" Scott picked up the San Magnum from the coffee table, put it under Mike's chin, and cocked it, saying, "I'm a ghost." The gunshot sent Scott Donovan's face covered in blood for the second time that day. July 30th, Brooklyn, New York, USA. Tool and dust. Peter, who had met Paul, had not yet fully woken up. He yawned and glanced at his watch. He shook his head as if he did not like the result. Peter Hammond had been a police officer for 13 years and Paul Carson's partner for almost 10 years. Peter Hammond was a shorter but broader man than Paul. The brunette detective always combed his hair back from his ears. Paul always compared him to a 1930s movie actor with this gesture, and insisted on calling one of them names every week. Duke had saved these two men from a major bribery trap, but that did not stop Peter Hammond from glaring at Duke. When Duke noticed this, Peter Hammond smiled charmingly while Joanna practically tried to hide in the turned-up collar of her jacket. Driving around Brooklyn just before dawn was a no-brainer. They had stopped in front of a grungy building at the corner of Hicks and Clark Streets and called for backup. Two cops had gotten out of their patrol car and nodded to the detectives as they arrived for backup. The female cop on the left was reporting to headquarters on her radio, "We've arrived at 50 Clark Street, rendezvous with Anton 16. Both squads were driving modified Ford Defenders. The Ford Defenders had been built to meet the need for armored police vehicles that had emerged after the economic crisis riots. The vehicle, essentially a four-door version of a 2010 Ford Mustang GT, had been armored to hold mid-range ballistic weapons. Peter Hammond opened the trunk and took off his bulletproof vest. Paul, who had joined him, put on his own vest while Peter Hammond pulled the M4 carabine from the trunk and loaded it. The detective, who had grabbed two spare magazines, shrugged as Paul looked at him. "We're in Brooklyn." The two detectives who went to Duke Perry, who was waiting for them in front of the apartment building with a cigarette in his hand, and his intern who was constantly yawning next to him, were quite nervous. The female police officer was only in her mid-20s. Her blue eyes were lost in the sockets under her thick eyebrows, and she had an unforgettable face with a prominent jaw and cheekbones. She was about 5 feet tall. She was considered athletic. While she was getting her shotgun from the back of the vehicle, her African-origin partner was attaching his M4 to his chest strap. The big African was almost 2 meters tall. He had a very wide chest and thick arms. When the man with the sergeant stripes on his left arm was done, he gave the detectives a stern nod of his head to indicate that they were ready. The apartment was old and literally worn out. Some of the lights were not working, some were just blinking at irregular intervals. The wallpaper was bulging, some parts were torn. As Perry climbed the stairs, she remembered the last time she had been in this building. At that moment, Joanna caught Perry's hand in order not to fall. The loud noise echoed through the apartment building as the police and detectives turned their intense white light flashlights on the girl. Perry had grabbed her by the thin waist and pulled her towards him. Sweat had formed on Joanna's forehead as she took Perry's aftershave, and her cheeks were visibly red. Swallowing, the girl realized that she wanted to leave herself to him. As if he knew this, Perry leaned over her ear and whispered in a mysterious and impressive tone, "Are you okay?" The girl just nodded. When Perry turned around, she secretly bit his finger. When they arrived at number 410, the detectives moved to either side and the police officers positioned themselves diagonally. One of the patrol officers behind them was checking the right side of the hallway, the other the left. When the police officers who had taken their places nodded, Paul checked the door first. The door opened with a weight like a ghost disappearing in the wind. Paul, looking at Peter Hammond, moved to the left corner of the door and prepared his gun and flashlight. He hunched over, pointed his gun, turned on his flashlight, and entered the door, where Paul, who was supposed to introduce himself as New York Police, according to normal procedures, was completely silent. Peter Hammond, who came right behind him, was both protecting Paul and checking the areas he wasn't looking at. Duke Perry, who had entered the house immediately behind them, was almost indifferent. Joanna was about to die of fright. But Duke, with his hands in his pockets, looked at the large house that had been destroyed. The house smelled of paint, and there were cans and brushes of cream-colored paint in the entrance. The living room and kitchen were painted, and it seemed that the corridor leading to the door had not yet been painted. Seeing blood on the floor at the point connecting the living room to the entrance hall, Paul turned the safety on his gun and showed Peter Hammond the blood trail. The house was quite large, The kitchen wall had been torn down and connected to the living room. There was a hallway on the left and a room door on the right. There was a closet next to the entrance door, and Paul had checked it at the entrance. The walls had been freshly painted in a cream color. The dark cream-colored curtains in the front matched the walls and the coffee and milk sofas. Seeing the blood on the floor, Perry raised his hand to stop Joanna. The blood stain was only a handspan in diameter. Then it extended 2 fingers thick, disappearing into the corridor with drag marks. Following these tracks, Paul found a woman's body in the bathroom. Lying in a pool of her own blood was a woman in her mid-20s with red bobbed hair, about 5 feet 6 inches tall. She was wearing pink pajamas. She had 2 bullet holes in her forehead and 1 in her chest. The bathroom had also been ransacked. "Who is this?" she asked Perry, who had come up behind her. "She doesn't look familiar, probably Tanner's fiancée," Perry grumbled, glancing at the girl for a moment. "How did you come to that conclusion?" Peter Hammond asked as he went to check the other rooms. The bedroom must have been at the end of the corridor. The girl's wearing an engagement ring, and the new look of the living room was way beyond Tanner's taste, Perry said, looking around nervously. "If you're right, why don't you come to our department on the weekends?" Paul said, his lips curling. "I wouldn't mind if you closed a few cases. They've piled up." Tanner's television was in pieces on the floor. The old, wide couch had been cut open with a knife and its insides had been taken out. Several shelves of books were scattered on the floor. The carpeting had been pulled aside, and some of the wood paneling had been removed. "It's clean," Paul said, coming out of the bathroom. Peter Hammond had looked into the bedroom. "It's clean," he replied, scanning the room. "They've done a thorough sweep of this place. I'm looking for crime scene investigation," he muttered. Joanna saw Duke walk toward the gaps in the floor. The old reporter just looked at one of them and leaned forward. Then he straightened up and asked, "Did they take everything?" "Yeah, no computers, no phones." "That must be for a camera," Paul said, looking at the empty devices on the floor. "It wasn't just a burglary," said Peter Hammond, who had come up behind them and was holding an M4 assault rifle in desert camouflage, and he put the weapon down on the kitchen counter. "There's a world of these in there," he said, while Joanna just looked at Perry. The reporter looked at the empty space on the floor again. Then he turned to examine the tall camera stands and the digital lens sets for long-range shooting that were propped up against the wall, then turned his head to look back at the wall in the entrance hall. Joanna saw a gap between the picture frames on the wall. Duke knew what the photograph in that gap was. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Joanna asked, coming quietly to Perry's side. She spoke in a quiet voice that the others couldn't hear, almost a whisper. "How did you know?" Duke muttered, straightening up, one eyebrow raised in curiosity. "You only checked one of the holes in the floor and then you looked at the missing photo on the wall," Joanna said, nodding slightly. Duke nodded his appreciation of Joanna and said, "Not bad at all. Yes, Tanner was my source for my Iraq coverage. I talked to him a lot here." "Could he have been killed because of the Iraq news?" The Duke sneered and shrugged, "Unlikely, but he did tell me about the latest news. By the way, there's still some gauze and dust on his long-range lenses." "What do you mean?" Joanna asked, raising an eyebrow. "Special forces tie the veil over the lens ports of binoculars and cameras to keep the lenses from glaring. Wherever Tanner took the photo, he did it recently and it had to be kept secret," Duke grumbled, looking at the camera parts in specially protected cases. "Blackmailed?" Joanna asked curiously. "I suppose so," muttered Duke, shaking his head vaguely. "It wasn't just a murder," Paul growled, leaning under Tanner's desk, a bug in his hand. Duke was standing next to the kitchen counter, staring at empty bottles of cheap whiskey. He grumbled, reaching into his flask in his jacket, and when he caught Joanna's eye, he pulled out only a cigarette from his pocket. "You can't smoke that in here," Paul said when he saw her. Perry nodded and went out into the hallway. Paul was right, the house was a crime scene now. Meanwhile, Peter Hammond looked at the incoming message on his phone and grumbled, "Damn it." He handed his phone to Paul, who was looking at him curiously, George Donovan. He was shot to death in his home. Witnesses saw a large young man in red sweatpants and denim pants walking away from the house. Mike Sullivan, Paul grumbled. Then he paused and said, "What about Scott?" He wasn't home. July 30th, Langley, Virginia, USA. He was a man of 5 feet 5, brown hair, and brown eyes. The right side of his face had once been torn apart and had been repaired by repeated plastic surgery. The broad-shouldered man had no forefinger or ring finger on his right hand. The man with the broad forehead had an angular face and a hooked nose, and he was not a type you would easily forget. Richard Knox had been deployed to the Iraq Civil War on his first mission and had been reduced to this state by an Al-Qaeda bomb. He wore a black eye patch behind his large, bony glasses. Polanov. He was missing his right eye, and he had acquired this defect during a mission he was proud of. He would not hide behind anything. He was what he was. When he was almost retired, the CIA noticed his incredible success in tracking reports. Knox, who was in his late 20s, was very good at correlating and analyzing the events he read. At 5 in the morning, Knox was walking nervously with a limp in the Langley buildings, the CIA's headquarters. His right leg was a finger's width shorter than the other. It was still 3 hours before his shift started, and most of the hallways and desks were empty. Knox had climbed from the second floor, where he worked as an analyst, to the third floor, almost crossing an entire floor. Knox entered the office of Broke Hall, the CIA's Central Europe director, without even knocking, and began to look at the reports on the desk without paying attention to Broke, who was looking at him curiously, and tossed aside the irrelevant ones. Broke, who stared at this strange man in shock for a while, finally pulled himself together and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Knox had found the report he was looking for. Broke was a schoolboy. Broke, who joined the CIA after graduating from college, had all of his experience at this desk. He was 5 feet tall, in his mid-40s. His hair had fallen out a lot. He was a slightly overweight man with blue eyes and a dark complexion, wearing rimless glasses. He had chubby cheeks and a pointed chin. He had unbuttoned the collar of his white shirt and taken off his tie. While Knox was reading the file, Brooke angrily reached for it when Knox grabbed her wrist and looked at her with one eye. While Brooke hesitated, afraid of both Knox's reflexes and his gaze, Knox put the file on the table. The report in this file was about the military power that a Serbian nationalist named Polanov had amassed in Serbia, and he released Brooke's wrist and tucked the first of 2 faxes into his back pocket, dropping them onto the table. Brooke looked at the crumpled paper. It was an emergency alert for a rescue operation in Nicaragua that had been completed an hour earlier. According to the memo, the DEA agent Jason Brucham, who was at the drug lord's former villa, had given Polanov's name before he died. Before the villa was bombed, the SEAL 5 had obtained evidence that they believed had been biologically tested. The information on their sites was now being uploaded to the Pentagon's information sharing network. Broke's greatest asset was that he was truly a professional. He had a flexible mind. He knew how to adapt to any situation. "Damn it," Broke hissed, and saw Knox hand him another piece of paper. It was an urgent fax from the New York National Security Agency. According to the fax, one of Polanov's lieutenants, Nat Fernandez, was in New York and was trying to contact a biology professor at Columbia University. "We're in trouble," the one-eyed man said dryly to Broke Hall. This frightened Broke more than anything. "It's not a problem. It's the fact that your wife has caught you with her mistress. This disaster. A goddamned catastrophic disaster." Swallowing and pulling himself together, he said, "What do you need?" Squinting, he thought for a moment. Knox said quickly and emotionlessly, "Unlimited access to SEAL 5 reports, operator direction, and access to field agents. Operations room and operator for tracking." "Did Cordillo see these?" Broke asked, narrowing her eyes and raising an eyebrow. Juan Cordillo was the head of analysis. Knox reported to him, he should see these printouts first. Knox shook his head. "At 5 in the morning? No, the faxes just came in. I was at the machines." "What were you doing here?" Broke asked curiously. She had stayed in the office to find out the results of a shipment in Afghanistan. Overtime, Knox said. He had a hard time socializing because of his facial condition. So he would often read old operation reports and make diagrams. The fact that he enjoyed it was a great advantage. Because it shaped what he read into his memory like adventure novels and recorded it in a way he would never forget. How serious is it? Brooke asked with a grunt. Knox put his finger on the facts and said, let's look at the SEAL 5 operations log. Then we'll call Professor Kermensky at Columbia University and ask him. Professor Kermensky was a professor specializing in infectious diseases. The NSA and the CIA had called him into threat assessment meetings on several occasions. Brooke looked at her watch. Okay, I'll handle the authorizations. You talk to Corrito, have him call me back. I'll tell him I've seized yours. Let's not go behind his back unnecessarily. In the meantime, we'll call Professor Kermensky and establish a connection, she said. Okay, Knox said, nodding slightly. It had only been a few hours since he had spoken to Broke. Cordio hadn't been as much of a problem as they had thought. Knox had chalked it up to him being called so early in the morning or getting rid of him, and hadn't dwelled on it. After the authorizations, Knox had turned to the computer screen with his coffee mug. He was watching the third image from SEAL 5. Seeing the plexiglass booths and the men inside in the HD images taken with the doctor's equipment, Knox cursed and put his coffee down on the table. He looked at his watch. 9:15, he muttered. He calmly called the professor, but the professor's cell phone didn't answer. Grumbling, Knox hung up and looked up the professor's home phone from his index, but still didn't get an answer. Cursing, he called the school, and when he heard from his secretary that Professor Kermensky hadn't arrived, he was looking at the notification fax next to his keyboard. Nat Fernandez is looking for a professor. He cursed, hung up, and called the FBI. Still, Knox knew it was too late to save Kermensky. July 30th, New York, USA. Domingo Sanchez. Leaning over the interrogation table, Adrian Kowalski asked loudly, "So where were you?" Scott pulled back as the detective shouted at him. His expressionless face resembled a statue, but Adrian could clearly see the hatred in his eyes. Scott had been caught by the police on the roof as he was walking back to his house. He hadn't resisted, he hadn't tried to escape. He had collapsed, shaking, when he heard that his father had been killed. Although the ambulance officer had insisted that the boy be taken to a hospital, Adrian hadn't paid him any attention. The detective had ordered the police officers on duty to take the young man to the police station immediately. He had to get the boy to talk before his lawyer arrived, whom he had questioned at first light. This was his only chance. "You had your father killed, didn't you? What happened with your brother? Was your father starting to interfere with your business?" he asked. His only chance was for Scott to let something slip. Scott's father George had been shot a few hours earlier. The cameras at the entrance to the building had captured the person who had shot George Donovan. The big, young man with the hood pulled over his head was Mike Sullivan, even though his face couldn't be seen. Adrian knew it had something to do with Scott, but he had no chance of proving it. What Adrian didn't know was that Scott had killed Mike Sullivan and his friends just hours before George was killed. Scott was stopped by the police in front of the apartment building. Although he was shocked when he saw his father's body, he could easily hear the conversations of the police at the scene. They had started looking for Mike for the second murder. Someone had wanted to kill his father and probably himself as well, and had framed Mike perfectly.